Jamal sat on the bench, flipping through his notebook, muttering softly to himself, "One step at a time, Jamal. You've got this." He was calm, focused, and unaware of the suspicion brewing in the eyes of Officer Rick Saunders, who had slowed his squad car nearby. Rick watched him with a hardened gaze, muttering under his breath, "Don't think I've seen him around here before." Pulling his car over, Rick stepped out, his hand brushing against his belt as he walked toward Jamal. "What are you doing here?" Rick asked sharply, his tone heavy with skepticism. Jamal looked up, keeping his voice steady. "Waiting for the bus, sir. It should be here in 10 minutes. Rick's eyes scanned Jamal's shirt, lingering briefly on the badge that read Civil Rights Intern. A mocking smirk crossed Rick's face. "Civil rights, huh? You think that badge means something? You think it gives you the right to hang around here like this?" Jamal, still calm, replied evenly, "It's not about what the badge means, sir. I'm just here, waiting for my bus." Rick crossed his arms, stepping closer. "Right. Just here, huh? Because guys like you don't cause trouble, right? How about you show me some ID?" Jamal's shoulders tensed, but he kept his voice measured. "Am I under arrest, officer?" Rick sneered, his smirk fading slightly. "You will be if you don't cooperate. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." With a deliberate calmness, Jamal pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. Rick snatched it from him, glancing at it briefly before tossing it back. "You people always think you can talk your way out of anything," Rick said with a laugh, his words dripping with disdain. Jamal took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the ID back into his pocket. "Officer, I'm just a student heading home. I don't want any trouble," he said firmly. Rick's expression darkened, his voice rising. "Trouble? You think I'm the one causing trouble here? You think I don't know what I'm doing?" Jamal's voice remained steady. "That's my bus, sir. May I go?" The sound of the approaching bus broke through the tense silence, but Rick wasn't done. "Not so fast. Let's make sure you're not hiding something first." Jamal exhaled slowly, whispering to himself, "Stay calm. Stay calm." The bus came and went, and Rick's mocking laughter filled the air. "Guess you'll have to wait for the next one," he sneered. Jamal stood tall, his voice firm yet calm. "I'm not hiding anything, officer. I've done nothing wrong." Rick stepped closer, his tone cold and menacing. "We'll see about that." Jamal met his gaze, his calm resolve masking the storm of emotions raging beneath. "Just another day, huh? Just another day," he murmured quietly to himself. Rick, unwilling to back down, gestured toward his car. "Let's go. We're not done here," he said. Jamal didn't move, his voice cutting through the tension. "I've done nothing wrong, and you know it," he said, his words carrying a quiet strength that made Rick pause for a moment before his smug expression returned. The moment hung heavy, unresolved, as the air between them thickened with unspoken tension. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Saunders said, his voice sharp as he towered over Jamal. His eyes scanned Jamal's face, his tone dripping with authority. "Where were you an hour ago?" Jamal took a deep breath, keeping his hands visible. "I've been here, waiting for my bus," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Saunders smirked, stepping closer. "Oh, you don't know? Convenient, huh?" His tone grew colder. "What's in the bag?" "It's just my notebook and some papers," Jamal said, motioning toward the bench. "I'm not hiding anything." "That's what they all say," Saunders muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. "Stand up," he ordered, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. Jamal hesitated but complied, rising slowly and standing tall. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said firmly, meeting Saunders' gaze. "You've got a real attitude, don't you?" Saunders snapped, taking a step closer. His eyes burned with frustration, mistaking Jamal's composure for defiance. "Show me some ID." Jamal sighed, reaching into his pocket slowly. "Here," he said, handing over his ID. Saunders snatched it and glanced at it briefly before tossing it back. "You think this proves anything?" he asked mockingly. "You people always think you're smarter than everyone else, think you can talk your way out of trouble." Jamal clenched his jaw, his chest tightening with frustration. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm just a student waiting for my bus, that's all." "Waiting for your bus?" Saunders repeated with a laugh. "You must think I'm an idiot. Let me tell you something. Guys like you don't just wait for buses. You're up to something." He stepped back, pulling out his handcuffs. "Turn around." Jamal's heart sank, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This isn't necessary," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I'm not resisting, and I haven't done anything." Saunders ignored him, grabbing Jamal's arm and snapping the cuffs into place. "You want to keep talking, or do you want to get in the car?" he sneered. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Why? Because it's my job," Saunders shot back, "and because people like you don't belong here." As Saunders led Jamal toward the squad car, a few onlookers gathered nearby, their murmurs growing louder. A woman raised her phone, recording the scene. "Hey, what's he done?" someone called out. Saunders glared at the growing crowd. "Mind your business," he barked. But the murmurs continued, and the tension in the air thickened. Jamal's belongings fell from his bag as Saunders shoved him into the back seat. His badge and papers scattered on the ground, unnoticed by Saunders but picked up by the camera phones of bystanders. Jamal glanced at the items, a pang of frustration and humiliation hitting him as the car door slammed shut. In the silence of the back seat, Jamal stared at his cuffed hands, his mind racing. He thought of his mother's voice, calm but firm. "Whatever happens, stay calm. Don't let them take your dignity." He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to drown out the weight of the moment. "I'm not what he thinks I am," he told himself. "I've worked too hard to be reduced to this." Saunders sat in the front seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the murmurs of the crowd faded behind him. He radioed in briefly, giving a vague description of Jamal to the station. Moments later, another officer's voice crackled over the radio. "Suspect spotted 2 blocks east. Male, mid-20s, wearing a red jacket." The description didn't match Jamal at all. Saunders frowned but said nothing, his pride refusing to let him admit his mistake. He glanced at Jamal in the rearview mirror, his expression hardening. "You've got a lot to learn, kid," he muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. Jamal didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the blurred buildings outside the window. In his mind, he replayed the events, feeling the weight of every word Saunders had thrown at him. But beneath the frustration and fear, a quiet resolve began to form. "This won't break me," he thought. "Not today, not ever." The car hummed with tension as it neared the station, both men lost in their thoughts. Saunders gripped the wheel tighter, while Jamal silently steeled himself for whatever came next. Saunders leaned back in his chair, his expression smug as he completed the paperwork. He glanced at Jamal, who sat silently in the processing room, his hands still cuffed. "You've got some nerve," Saunders muttered, shaking his head. "Thinking that badge means anything in here." Jamal said nothing, his calm gaze fixed on the table. Inside, his anger simmered, but he knew better than to let it show. Saunders tossed the clipboard onto the desk and grabbed Jamal's ID again. "What's this supposed to be anyway?" Saunders sneered, holding up the badge. His eyes scanned the text, and for a moment the room went silent. The words clicked in Saunders' mind like a warning bell. Civil Rights Intern, Local Law Enforcement Oversight Committee. His confidence faltered, his smirk fading into something closer to unease. What is this?" he asked, his voice losing its edge. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his tone steady. "It's exactly what it says. I work with a civil rights organization that monitors law enforcement behavior, including incidents like this." Saunders' hand wavered, and he set the badge down carefully, his composure visibly cracking. "You could have said something earlier," he muttered defensively, avoiding Jamal's gaze. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but unyielding. "And why would that have mattered? You didn't see a student or a mentor or even a human being when you looked at me. You saw a threat, and that says more about you than it does about me." The room felt heavier, Jamal's words hanging in the air like an accusation that couldn't be ignored. Saunders opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. The sound of footsteps outside the door broke the tension, and 2 officers stepped in, one of them the station's chief. "What's going on here?" the chief asked, his sharp eyes darting between Jamal and Saunders. The younger officer whispered something to him, handing over Jamal's badge and ID. The chief's expression tightened as he studied the items. "Officer Saunders, can I see you outside?" Saunders hesitated, glancing at Jamal, who remained seated, his expression calm but firm. Saunders stammered, but followed the chief out of the room. Jamal sat in silence, his mind replaying the events that had led him here. He thought about the humiliation, the anger, the weight of being reduced to a stereotype yet again. But he also felt a quiet sense of pride. His dignity remained intact, even when everything else had been stripped away. When the door opened again, the chief walked in, his face stern. Saunders trailed behind him, his shoulders slumped. The chief walked over to Jamal, unlocking his cuffs. "I want to apologize for this incident," he said, his tone formal but sincere. "You're free to go." Jamal rubbed his wrists, the sting of the cuffs lingering. "An apology doesn't erase what happened," he said quietly, meeting the chief's eyes. "But I appreciate it." The chief nodded, his face unreadable. "We'll be reviewing the body cam footage and addressing this internally. Rest assured, this isn't over." Jamal stood, collecting his belongings. His badge and papers had been carefully returned to him, but the damage had already been done. As he walked out of the station, the murmurs of a crowd reached his ears. He paused, stepping outside to see a group of community members gathered in solidarity. Some held signs, others simply stood in silent support. A woman stepped forward, her voice breaking the quiet. "We saw what happened. You didn't deserve that." Jamal nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about demanding better." The crowd quieted as Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger. "They tried to define me by their prejudice, but I choose to define myself by my actions. Change starts with us. Even when the road feels impossible, together, we can make them see that we deserve better. We demand better." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in agreement. Jamal felt a wave of emotion wash over him, not just anger or frustration, but hope. He glanced back at the station where a few officers watched from the window. Their expressions were unreadable, But Jamal knew the shift had already begun. He turned back to the crowd, standing tall. This wasn't the end of his fight, it was only the beginning. As he walked away, the voices of the community followed him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this struggle. He wasn't just walking away from an injustice, he was walking toward change. "Officer Saunders," the voice of the police chief was sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. The investigation into your actions begins now." Saunders' shoulders slumped as he stood before the chief, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet, defeated air. The words hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to protest, but the chief's glare silenced him. "This isn't just about protocol violations," the chief continued. "It's about accountability. Your actions today have consequences, not just for you, but for this entire department." Saunders nodded stiffly, his throat dry. "I understand," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a mix of anger and unease. Later, alone in his small, dimly lit office, Saunders replayed the incident in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the body cam footage on his computer screen. The image of Jamal, calm and composed despite the humiliation, refused to leave his thoughts. He paused the video on the moment where Jamal had said, "You didn't see a person when you looked at me. You saw a threat." The words echoed in his head, louder than they had sounded at the time. For the first time, doubt crept in, piercing through the wall of defensiveness he had built over the years. Saunders rubbed his temples, his confidence unraveling. "Was I wrong?" he whispered to no one. The question lingered in the silence, unanswered. Jamal sat at his desk, a stack of notes in front of him. He was tired, but his determination burned brighter than his exhaustion. His phone buzzed with messages, community leaders, activists, and even reporters reaching out after the viral video of his arrest spread across social media. "We need to move forward with this," Jamal said, looking up at his colleague from the civil rights organization. "It's not just about me. This has to mean something." "You're right," his colleague replied. "Your story has already inspired so many people. We're organizing a workshop on racial bias and community policing next week. We want you to lead it." Jamal nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "If my experience can help others, then I'm all in." The video of the incident had taken on a life of its own. Recorded by a bystander, it showed every humiliating moment, from Saunders' mocking words to Jamal's quiet strength in the face of adversity. It spread quickly, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. Online, hashtags demanding police reform trended for days. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Jamal's voice and turning his experience into a rallying point for conversations about systemic racism. The day of his scholarship interview arrived. Jamal stood in front of the interview panel, his hands steady and his voice calm. "Tell us about a challenge you've overcome and how it shaped who you are," one of the interviewers asked. Jamal paused, taking a deep breath. "A few weeks ago, I was arrested for sitting at a bus stop," he began, his tone firm but reflective. "I was accused of something I didn't do, because of how I look. That moment could have broken me, but instead it reminded me of why I do the work I do. It strengthened my resolve to fight for justice and to be a voice for those who don't have one." The panel listened intently as Jamal spoke, his confidence radiating with every word. Jamal's voice rang out in a calm, steady tone. "They tried to define me by their prejudice, but I choose to define myself by my actions. Change starts with us, even when the road feels impossible." The weight of his words lingered in the air, inspiring those who heard them. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to a movement, to a community fighting for a better future. As Jamal walked forward, his head held high, his journey stood as a testament to resilience and hope. The power to demand change, he realized, was in each step he took.